I'm going to go to Glasgow very soon to talk about contract drafting for a certain client. Now, let's talk about contract drafting in terms of avoiding ambiguities and maintaining consistency. Let's go for it. Okay, my friend. Now, we all understand a contract has to be consistent within itself. And over my past years, I've noticed that in the contract documents, many of the times, the documents themselves are not consistent, to say the least. And sometimes it will create ambiguities, to say the least. Worse still, sometimes it will generate unnecessary disputes, and that will be quite troublesome. And that is the reason why for today, let's talk about contract drafting. If you're the client here, it will be quite useful for you, I hope. Once again, subscribe and click the notification button. I know this is quite old school, but give me some motivation, okay? I try to make a video every week here just to support this industry a little bit. Now, when we talk about NEC 4, ECC, when we talk about avoiding ambiguities or how to deal with inconsistencies, we sort of brush it off during the training course. We sort of brush it off even during the practice, even during contract drafting. Why? Because we are working not on our own, but we have different team members to work on a certain contract. If those team members do not talk with each other, do not communicate on how they are going to write the contract for a certain part of that contract document, then many of the times inconsistencies and ambiguities will occur. How to deal with it? Contract-wise, it's very easy. In terms of contract, it's very easy, but it's easier said than done. Which clause applies? The clause is, of course, clause 17.1. Clause 17.1, I'm speaking from NEC 4 ECC contract. In fact, many of the contracts under NEC 4 and NEC 3, the principles are the same. The principle is, if there is an ambiguity or an inconsistency within or between documents, then the project manager will make a statement on how to deal with that ambiguity and inconsistency. Now, some people try to differentiate ambiguities from inconsistencies. In some sense, it is okay. But at the end of the day, it is a project manager to state how that ambiguity or inconsistency should be dealt with. For example, a project manager may give an instruction to change the scope. If A is inconsistent with B, then you either change A or B. Or, for some other instance, you may want to go to the site information to look up that physical condition to see how to deal with that ambiguity in terms of ground conditions, for example. That is the contract way of dealing with things. But if we think about the practice, if we think about contract drafting, how to avoid that? Instead of waiting until the contract stage and let the project manager to deal with it, which may generate unnecessary compensation events, unnecessary admin works. Come on, all these QSs, their life is harsh. So save them some time to deal with something more important. If the contract can be drafted in such a way that these inconsistencies can be avoided, is that not good? Or is that not better? So when we talk about ambiguities and inconsistencies, there are two things that we need to be aware of. The first one is the inconsistencies and ambiguities within the works itself. How often will you see a civil engineering drawing will be totally consistent with the M&E drawings? Never in my case. I know the industry outside is getting better and better, but it is so common that two sets of drawings are inconsistent itself. For example, the wall openings, The wall openings from the civil engineering drawings may be quite different from the wall openings, at least the size, for example, or the position, for example, of that wall opening in the M&E drawings. Then in NEC 4, we need the project manager to say, now, this time round, the civil engineering drawing will prevail. That time round, the M&E drawings will prevail. Even within the M&E drawings, you have M and E. Are they consistent? So during contract drafting, if you are drafting the scope, at least if you can dedicate a certain team or several people to look at the scope itself, to look at the works itself, go through everything in terms of the works, the description, and the specification to make sure they are consistent. And that can save a lot of time and cost during the contract stage. Another thing here is about the obligations itself. So number one is about the works, the drawings, M&E civil. The second one is about the obligations itself. Now these obligations are well defined in the contract. But it's one thing to have a contract document in front of you. It is another thing that you are doing your contract drafting in accordance with the contract principles, especially if you're the contract drafter, if you are from the client side. Then you are the kings and queens. I always say so. You are the kings and queens, you can do whatever you want. But make sure you do something with good intention and good execution with good consequences. Things like what? Things like contractor's obligations. The contractor's main responsibilities under clause 20, under section 2, is to work in accordance with the scope. The contract says the contractor is to provide the works in accordance with the scope. And by the way, do you know there are two parts in the scope? I do have another video for this. If you struggle to understand that phrase, just go to my another video. There are two parts in the scope. Do you understand there is a client scope? Or under the contract, it says the scope provided by the client, and there is another scope provided by the contractor for its design. So a contractor under the contract bears the obligation to provide the works in accordance with the scope. Not pricing document, not site information. And please do not put your activity schedule in the scope. An activity schedule is not part of the scope. Why? If you really put an activity schedule into the scope, guess what? An activity schedule may be changed depending on different options, depending on different circumstances. Every single time you change the activity schedule, if you put an activity schedule in the scope, oh my goodness, then you are changing the scope. Then guess what? Clause 60.1, number 1 says, if there is a change to the scope, that may become a compensation event, and that will be disastrous. And that is the reason why the activity schedule is not part of the scope. And since the contractor is going to provide the works in accordance with the scope, you are going to specify the works not in the activity schedule, not in the site information, but in the scope. What is the scope? The scope, simply put, is drawings and specifications. So why is that? It's a set of documents. It's a set of documents describing and specifying the works. If you put the works, the specification and description in the site information, for example, then you better make sure the description in the site information will be consistent with the scope itself. And of course, you shouldn't put something as in the works in the site information, because that is not what the contract says that the contractor needs to provide the works in accordance with. And that is one thing. I've seen multiple occasions whereby some of the clients, they try to put in some description of the works to be provided by the contractor in the site information, and at the same time in the scope. Now, contractually speaking, we look at the scope no matter what. But just in case if they exist in both documents, and if they are contradicting with each other, then guess what? An adjudicator, of course, they will follow the contract obligations and all this, but they need to look at the whole contract itself. If there are two clauses which are directly contradicting with each other, that may generate an unnecessary compensation event, to say the least, and that will, at the end, even worse, generate unnecessary disputes. And this is just one thing. That's about the works. The second thing, talking about obligations. For example, the site information this time. The site information is a set of documents mainly to assess the compensation events regarding to physical conditions. The contract says in judging the physical conditions, you look at the site information. Which clause? Clause 60.2. Now, if the site information contains not just the information to judge the physical conditions, but say if you put in the works in there, if you put in some program requirement in there, I've seen that. If you put in all sorts of different materials and information in the site information, then that may generate some problem. Why? Because obviously you will have another program requirement in the scope. Then in that case, which document to look at? And that is the reason why good contract drafting simply means what? It simply means now NEC 4, NEC 3, this set of contract principles, they try to let us categorize different information into different categories according to their functions. We just need to follow the different requirements and different functions of each category and put in different information into the right category. That is good contract drafting. Nothing about legalistic language, nothing about how beautiful your English is. It's as simple as putting the right information into the right category according to the NEC functions. And that is basic contract drafting. Take, for example, another example is pricing documents. Pricing documents, for example, an activity schedule. Then an activity schedule, the pricing statement of which should not be in the scope. It should be in the tender document, for example. It should be in the pricing document itself, for example, because that is a pricing document. For example, a bill of quantities. So you mentioned that sort of items, you price it per meter of water pipes, for example. Then you give a price according to a certain rate, for example. That sort of statement should be in the pricing document itself. For example, the method of measurement, not in the scope. All I try to say is in order to avoid unnecessary ambiguities and inconsistencies, we need to follow the different principles when we draft the contract. Especially when you're the client. If the root is wrong, everything will be wrong. So if you draft the contract wrong, then everything out of that contract will be problematic. This is a reminder, so I hope that is useful for you. Next time, we'll talk about something else. Thank you very much.